It was a September morning when Frank and Dorothy Miller, 72 and 68 years old, found themselves abandoned on the side of Highway 85 in rural Georgia with 2 cardboard suitcases and broken hearts. Their 3 children had driven them away from the family farm under the pretense of a day trip, but really to get rid of them permanently. Robert, the eldest son, had screamed that they had become a burden, that he couldn't support them anymore, that they needed to figure things out on their own. As the car drove away in a cloud of dust, Frank held Dorothy's trembling hand, both of them incredulous at such cruelty. But what the children completely ignored was that in the old tin box hidden under the basement floor, Frank had jealously guarded a secret worth over $2 million for 40 years, an inheritance that would have forever changed the fate of the entire family. If only they had known that love and respect are worth more than any riches. Frank Miller woke up that September morning with a strange feeling in his chest. At 72 years old, after a lifetime of working the land and raising 3 children with endless sacrifices, he had learned to trust his instincts. But when his son Robert knocked on the door of the small farmhouse in rural Georgia at 7 in the morning, Frank thought maybe he was wrong. Robert was 45 years old, worked as a county clerk, and had always viewed his parents as a burden. Ever since his mother, Dorothy, had started having memory problems and his father, Frank, moved more slowly due to arthritis, Robert did nothing but complain about the costs and responsibilities. That morning's excuse was a family trip. Robert told his parents to pack 2 suitcases, that Mark and Frances were waiting in the car for a nice day together. Frank looked at his wife, Dorothy, 68 years old, who smiled with that sweetness that had won his heart 50 years before. They were happy at the idea of seeing all their children together. With the enthusiasm of those who don't have many opportunities to go out, Frank and Dorothy packed their best things. Frank put his white Sunday shirt in the suitcase. Dorothy her blue dress from their granddaughter's wedding. They were ready for what they believed would be a special day. Mark, 40 years old, was at the wheel. He managed a small electronics shop that was always doing worse. Frances, 35 years old, worked as a hairdresser and had 2 small children. Both had the same grim look as Robert, as if they were going to a funeral. During the trip, Frank tried to make conversation, asking about the grandchildren, work, future plans. But the children answered in monosyllables, avoiding his gaze in the rearview mirror. Dorothy watched the Georgia countryside scroll past the window, holding Frank's hand. After 2 hours of driving, Mark pulled over along Highway 85, in the middle of nowhere. Only cotton fields, a few scattered houses in the distance, and the sun already high, promising a scorching day. The order to get out came sharply from Robert. When Frank didn't understand, Robert turned toward his parents with an icy expression. They couldn't keep them anymore. They cost too much. They were too old, too sick, too useless. They would sell the house, dividing everything 3 ways. The parents had to find another place to stay. Frank looked at his children's faces and saw strangers. These weren't the babies he had held in his arms, for whom he had worked under the scorching sun, whom he had taught to walk. These had become monsters of selfishness. When Frank asked to at least be taken to town, Robert replied that it was only 3 miles on foot. It would do them good to walk. Dorothy began crying silently as Robert pulled the suitcases from the trunk. Frank told them that one day they would understand what they had done, and he hoped they could forgive themselves. Robert huffed, saying to save the sermons because they were adults aware of their actions. The car drove off, raising a cloud of dust that enveloped the 2 elderly people. Frank and Dorothy stood still on the side of the road, with their 2 cardboard suitcases, watching the car disappear over the horizon. In that moment, Frank didn't tell Dorothy what weighed on his heart like a boulder. In the basement of the house the children were about to sell, hidden under old tomato crates, there was a tin box that contained the secret of a lifetime. A secret worth more than $2 million, and one that those ungrateful children would never know about. As Frank and Dorothy walked slowly along the dusty road, with the sun beating down mercilessly and the suitcases getting heavier and heavier, Frank thought back to the box hidden in the basement. A secret he had kept for 40 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it to his children. It was 1982 when it all began. Frank worked as a farmhand for the Caldwell family, the richest landowners in the area. One day, while plowing a field that hadn't been cultivated in years, his tractor got stuck near an old oak tree. While digging to free the wheels, Frank hit something metallic. It was a military box from World War II, buried for who knows how long. Inside were yellowed documents, vintage photos, and, most importantly, a detailed map showing the location of other boxes hidden on the property. Frank immediately understood he had found a war treasure, probably hidden by fleeing soldiers or families trying to save their belongings from bombing. Instead of telling the owners, Frank decided to continue the search in secret. In the following months, working at night and on days off, he managed to find 5 other boxes. Inside were gold coins, antique jewelry, precious watches, and even some small works of art. A treasure Frank estimated was worth at least $2 million. But Frank was an honest man. He didn't feel comfortable keeping something that didn't completely belong to him. He did research and discovered that the original family who owned the treasure had been wiped out during the war. There were no heirs, no one who could legally claim those assets. He then decided to hide everything in his basement, waiting for the right moment to use that money. He wanted his children to study, to have a better life than his. He imagined revealing the secret when he saw enough wisdom and maturity in them to handle such wealth. But the children grew up differently than he hoped. Robert became arrogant and materialistic, increasingly interested in easy money rather than honest work. Mark proved to be weak, unable to handle even the simplest responsibilities. Frances developed a harsh and judgmental character, seeing her parents only as an economic burden. Frank continued to wait, hoping that sooner or later they would show signs of maturity, respect, true love. But the more years passed, the more he became convinced that wealth would only completely ruin them. Now, walking under the sun with his wife leaning more and more heavily on his arm, Frank regretted never revealing the secret. Not to give them the money, but to see their faces when they would understand what they had lost with their cruelty. When Dorothy confessed her fear about the future, Frank reassured her, saying he had a plan. Their children would soon discover what it means to lose something precious. Arriving in town, Frank went directly to lawyer Thomas Greek, a 60-year-old man he had known forever. He told him everything: the children's abandonment, the house they wanted to sell, and especially the treasure hidden in the basement. The lawyer was speechless when Frank showed him photos he had secretly taken over the years. Roman-era gold coins, Art Deco jewelry, a small painting that seemed to be by a famous artist. When he asked why he had never told anyone, Frank replied that he was waiting for his children to become people worthy of receiving it. But that day he had understood it would never happen. Frank asked the lawyer to prepare a very particular will. All the treasure would go to charity, to poor families in town, to lonely elderly people, to children who needed medical care. Not $1 to his children. But first, he wanted them to know exactly what they had lost. 3 days after the abandonment, Robert, Mark, and Frances met at the family home to organize the sale. They had already contacted a real estate agency, and a buyer seemed interested. The idea of dividing the money from the sale had made them euphoric, as if they had freed themselves of an enormous weight. Robert walked through the rooms with the air of someone who had finally taken control of the situation. Mark checked what could be sold separately, while Frances made an inventory of valuable objects. None of them had called to find out how their parents were doing, where they had slept those nights, if they had found a place to stay. The house was worth at least $180,000, Robert calculated with satisfaction. $60,000 each for getting rid of the problem. They had to empty it completely because the buyer wanted it vacant. That's how they began emptying the basement. Among the old tomato crates, work tools and canning jars, Mark noticed that under some floorboards there was an empty space. Curious, he lifted the boards and found the hiding place that Frank had built with such care. But the tin box was no longer there. There was only the imprint in the earth, which clearly showed that something had been hidden there for years. The dimensions suggested a medium-sized box, and the earth around it was darker, as if it had been recently disturbed. That's when Lawyer Greek arrived. He had seen them enter the house and had decided it was time to deliver the letter Frank had written for them. The three siblings looked at each other perplexed when the lawyer introduced himself as their father's legal counsel. They didn't know Frank had a lawyer. Robert opened the letter with trembling hands. What he read made him pale. Frank wrote that if they were reading that letter, it meant they had found the hiding place in the basement. What they were looking for was no longer there, because he had taken it with him. For 40 years, he had kept a secret worth over $2 million, a treasure he had found as a young man, and kept hidden waiting for the right moment to give it to them. He had dreamed of leaving them this inheritance when they had proven to become worthy people, respectful, capable of true love. But they had chosen to abandon their parents on the side of a road like trash. They had shown that the only thing that interested them was money. But ironically, they had lost the real money chasing the pennies from selling the house. The treasure had been donated to charity. It would go to poor families in town, to abandoned elderly like them, to children who needed care, all people who deserved that money more than they did. Robert threw the letter on the floor and started screaming. $2 million thrown away out of spite. But Lawyer Greek corrected him firmly. It wasn't spite, it was justice. Frank had every right to do what he wanted with his assets. When the siblings asked where their parents were now, the lawyer smiled, saying they were safe and happier than they had ever been with them. The truth was that Frank and Dorothy had been welcomed into the finest nursing home in the region, one that normally cost $3,000 a month. Frank had paid 10 years in advance, guaranteeing himself and his wife excellent medical care, quality food, and, most importantly, the dignity their children had tried to take away. Additionally, he had donated $500,000 to the county to build a senior center dedicated to the memory of parents abandoned by their children. The rest had gone to the children's hospital to buy medical equipment. The lawyer added the final blow. The house wasn't theirs to sell. Frank had already deeded it to Catholic Charities 3 years before. They wouldn't inherit a single dollar. Robert, Mark, and Francis understood they had lost everything.
Tu aimes cette histoire, ma quoi? Laisse un petit like et abonne-toi à la chaîne. Maintenant, reprenons la vidéo.
Not just the money, but also the love and respect of the only man who had loved them unconditionally. And there was no way to go back. At Peaceful Meadows Nursing Home, 20 miles from their hometown, Frank and Dorothy were living the most serene days of recent years. The facility was nestled in a park of pine and oak trees, with bright rooms and qualified staff who treated every resident with respect and kindness. Frank had a single room overlooking the garden, where he spent mornings reading and watching birds. Dorothy had a room next to his, cared for by nurses specialized in memory problems. For the first time in years, there was no worry in their faces. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the facility director, often told Frank about Dorothy's particularly lucid days, when she asked for him and wanted to prepare biscuits like she used to. The nursing home had an open kitchen, where residents could cook together with staff, keeping their traditions and dignity alive. Frank and Dorothy prepared Southern cornbread together, the dish she cooked better than anyone else. While mixing, Dorothy sang old country songs that Frank hadn't heard in years. In those moments, she seemed like the woman he had married 50 years before. Dorothy remembered when the children were small. Robert, who always helped in the kitchen, Mark, who stole raw dough, Frances, who wanted to do everything herself. Frank nodded, without saying what he thought. It was better that Dorothy, in her moments of confusion, remembered only the good. Meanwhile, in town, News of Frank's donation had spread through all the families. The senior center about to be built was already nicknamed Frank's Place, and many people came to visit him to thank him. Every week, elementary school children went to Peaceful Meadows to bring drawings and letters. Frank had organized a storytelling workshop where he told the little ones Georgia legends he had learned from his grandfather. He had become the grandfather to all those children who listened to him wide-eyed. One Sunday morning, while Frank was sitting in the garden with some friends from the nursing home, he saw a familiar car arrive. Robert, Mark, and Francis got out, looking dejected, dressed better than usual but with faces marked by shame. Frank watched them approach without getting up from the bench. He felt no anger, only deep sadness for what they had done to themselves. Robert said they needed to talk, but Frank replied they had nothing to say to each other. They had made their choice that day on the road. When Robert objected that they didn't know about the treasure, Frank slowly stood up, leaning on his cane. If he had told them about the treasure, they would have taken the money and then abandoned him anyway. The difference was that now they knew what they had lost. Francis started crying, asking if they could start over. Frank looked at her for a long time, explaining that at 72 years old, with Dorothy at 68, they didn't have time to start over. They only had time to live in peace what remained. When Mark desperately said they were his children, Frank replied that his children were those kids who came to visit him every week, the poor families he blessed every day, all those who had shown that love matters more than money. Robert made one last attempt, proposing to take care of him, to bring him home. Frank smiled sadly, asking what home, since they had sold it. And anyway, he was already home. There he was, treated with respect, cared for with love, surrounded by people who loved him for who he was. The three siblings remained silent, realizing there was nothing to add. They had forever lost their father's love, and no amount of money could buy it back. Frank walked toward the nursing home without looking back. He had a life to live, surrounded by true love and authentic respect. 2 years after the abandonment, Frank and Dorothy's life at the nursing home had become an example for the entire community. Frank, now 74, had become the reference point for all residents and many families in town. His story had been told in local newspapers, and many people came to him for advice on difficult relationships with children. Dorothy, despite memory problems, had increasingly serene days. Doctors said the loving, stress-free environment had significantly slowed the progression of her illness. When she was lucid, she helped in the kitchen and taught other residents to make homemade biscuits. When she was confused, staff treated her with infinite patience. The senior center, built with Frank's money, had been inaugurated with a moving ceremony. Frank's Place had become a model for the entire state, a place where elderly people weren't parked and forgotten, but valued for their experience and wisdom. Every Thursday, Frank held a life stories class where he told episodes of old Georgia to young people from town. It was incredible to see 15-year-olds listen, fascinated to adventures from when there were no cell phones and internet, when families gathered in the evening to tell stories around the fire. One spring morning, Frank received an unexpected visit. It wasn't his children, who hadn't been seen for months, but his granddaughter Claire, Francis's daughter. She was 17 years old, with intelligent eyes and a determined air that reminded Frank of her mother when she was young. Claire apologized for what her mother had done, but Frank told her she didn't need to apologize for adults' mistakes. The girl confessed she had been so ashamed she couldn't even leave the house, but had decided she wanted to become the kind of person he would be proud to call his granddaughter. From that day, Claire kept her promise to come every week. Every Saturday afternoon she arrived at Peaceful Meadows with homework to do and stayed until evening. Frank helped her with history and literature. She helped him with computers and social media to document the senior center's activities. Claire also started bringing her friends. First one, then two, then an entire group of high school students who were fascinated by Frank's stories and wanted to help as volunteers. Soon, Peaceful Meadows became the center of a youth solidarity movement that involved the whole town. Frank watched these generous young people and thought maybe not everything was lost. If his granddaughter and her friends represented the future, then there was still hope for humanity. One evening, while Claire helped him prepare material for the next day's class, she asked if he ever missed his mother and uncles. Frank replied that he missed the children they once were. Robert at 5 following him through the fields, Mark at 8 waiting for him at the window every evening, Francis as a child bringing him drawings from school. When Claire said she was proud of him because he was the richest man she knew, Frank asked rich in what? The granddaughter's answer was simple: in everything that really matters. Frank understood he had truly won. He had lost 3 ungrateful children, but had gained the love of a special granddaughter, the affection of hundreds of people who respected him, and the certainty of having made the right choice. The most precious legacy wasn't the $2 million he had donated. It was the example he had given, showing that dignity can't be bought and that true love can't be lost. It can only transform and multiply in unexpected ways. 5 years after that terrible day on the highway, Frank Miller was 77 years old and had become a living legend throughout Georgia. His story had inspired television documentaries, national newspaper articles, and even a book written by a journalist who had come to interview him. Dorothy, now 73, had good days and difficult days, but was surrounded by such sincere love that even in moments of greatest confusion, she seemed serene. Frank had never left her alone for a day, and their love had become an example for all couples who knew them. Frank's place, the senior center, had become a model copied throughout America. Delegations of social workers came from every state to study how this facility worked, where elderly people weren't just assisted, but valued, where the wisdom of age became wealth for the entire community. Frank had created a true cultural movement. His Memory Thursdays attracted people from across the state. Universities and schools organized visits for their students to meet this extraordinary man who had transformed pain into love and betrayal into opportunity. Claire was 19 and had become his official assistant. She studied social work at college and had chosen Frank as the subject of her thesis. But more than a case study, she had become the daughter he had never truly had. One December morning, Frank felt particularly tired. Doctors said it was normal at his age, but he knew his body was starting to send signals. He wasn't afraid of death, but wanted to make sure he had settled everything. He called lawyer Greek and had a final document drawn up. Everything that remained of his assets went to Claire, not because she was his granddaughter, but because she had proven to deserve that trust. When Claire protested, saying she didn't want his money, Frank explained it wasn't money, but responsibility. She would have to continue what he had started. Frank's place would need someone to protect it when he was no longer there. That same week, something unexpected happened. Robert, Mark, and Francis showed up together at Peaceful Meadows. He hadn't seen them for almost 3 years, and Frank immediately noticed they had changed. They looked like people who had suffered, who had learned something important at their own expense. Robert explained they had come to ask forgiveness, not for money or inheritance, but just for the harm they had done him. In recent years, they had understood. Their children looked at them like they had looked at him with annoyance, as if they were a burden. They were reaping what they had sown. Mark added that his son had told him that when he got old, he would put him in a nursing home and forget about him, just like they had done with Frank. Frank felt deep sadness, but not for himself. He was sad for them, for the pain they had built for themselves. When they asked what he wanted from them, Robert replied they wanted nothing. They just wanted him to know he had been right about everything. Frank looked at them and saw his children for the first time in years, not the monsters of selfishness they had become. They were repentant, but it was too late to start over. Lost time can't be recovered. Betrayed love doesn't repair easily. He forgave them sincerely, but explained that forgiving didn't mean forgetting. They had chosen not to have a father when they needed one. He had learned to live without having children. Now they were two different families who forgave each other, but could no longer be united. The three siblings nodded, accepting that painful but just truth. When they left, Frank felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't happy to have lost his children, but was serene about having made the right choices. That evening, sitting in the garden with Dorothy sleeping on his shoulder and Claire reading beside them, Frank looked at the stars and smiled. He was 77 years old, had a wife he loved, a granddaughter who adored him, hundreds of people who respected him, and the certainty of having lived with dignity. The greatest legacy he was leaving wasn't money or property, but the example he had given, that true love can't be bought, that real family is chosen, and that the greatest wealth is the respect of those who truly know you. Frank Miller had become the richest man in Georgia without owning a single dollar. Like, if you believe respect for the elderly is a fundamental value, comment which part of the story touched you most. Share to inspire those who still believe in family values and respect. Subscribe for more stories of justice and second chances. Sometimes those who abandon out of greed lose more than those who are abandoned. Sometimes true love is found where you least expect it. And sometimes the greatest wealth is the respect of those who really know you. Because true inheritance isn't money, but the example you leave for others.